Jasmine Crockett sat upright in her congressional seat, her eyes calmly scanning the room as the debate over the new legislative bill escalated. Just across the chamber, Nancy Mace was mid-sentence, her voice sharp, her tone colder than usual. Keystrokes and murmurs filled the air, but Jasmine stayed locked in. Then, without warning, Mace's words turned personal. Some people in this room should worry less about eyeliner and more about understanding the Constitution, she said, without even glancing in Jasmine's direction. But everyone in the chamber knew exactly who she meant. A few gasps shot through the room, eyes darted, and all heads turned to Jasmine. Even the chairman leaned forward, sensing something had just shifted in the energy. Jasmine didn't flinch. She simply set her notes down on the polished wood, folded her hands together, and looked directly at Nancy Mace. The silence that followed was thick. Nancy smirked and crossed her arms, satisfied with the blow she thought she landed. She hadn't expected a response, not right away. But Jasmine stood up slowly, adjusted her blazer, and asked the chairman if she could have the floor. The chairman hesitated for a second, then nodded. Jasmine walked to the podium with a calm that didn't match the storm everyone could see building in her eyes. The room was still. She placed both palms on the sides of the podium, leaned in just slightly, and spoke no notes. No prepared remarks, just her voice, and the weight behind it. "I don't mind being underestimated," she began, her voice measured. "I've been underestimated since the day I walked into law school, the day I walked into courtrooms, and the day I walked into this very chamber. But what I will not accept is being disrespected, not today, not on record, and not from someone who knows better." That single line pulled everyone in. Phones were lowered. Staffers stopped typing. Even Mace's confident posture began to shrink as Jasmine's voice grew steadier, louder, more precise. "You want to talk about the Constitution? Let's do that," Jasmine continued, her voice now carrying through the entire room. "Because while some of us came here to look pretty, others of us came here to protect civil liberties, to speak for the unheard, to write laws that will change lives. And if you've got a problem with that, you don't have a problem with me. You've got a problem with the people who elected me to be here." Her hand gestured out to the chamber, to the very voters Mace had just insulted by proxy. Nancy Mace looked rattled. She reached for her notepad, but Jasmine wasn't done. "I'm here because I earned it, not because someone handed it to me. And I didn't come to Congress to exchange cheap shots over makeup or fashion. I came here because children in my district are starving. Women are fighting to stay alive, and justice still hasn't come to the communities that raised me." She paused, letting that line land. "So while you throw jabs, I'll throw down solutions. While you posture, I legislate. And when history records what happened here today, it won't remember your insult, it will remember what I did next." The room had no response. None. What Jasmine had done wasn't just defend herself. She'd taken the insult, shattered it into pieces, and rebuilt it into something bigger, something no one could ignore. And though no one clapped, no one spoke, no one moved, what Jasmine had just set in motion could already be felt. It wasn't over. Not even close. Nancy Mace blinked hard, visibly rattled as she sat frozen in her seat. The silence Jasmine had left in her wake still hung in the chamber like the aftershock of a thunderclap. You could hear pages being turned more carefully now, pens hovering mid-air, unsure whether to keep writing or just watch. Even the C-SPAN camera seemed to linger longer on Jasmine than it usually did. Jasmine, for her part, hadn't moved from the podium. She stood tall, not triumphant, not smug, just quietly defiant. And that unnerved people more than any raised voice ever could. Nancy, desperate to recover the floor, raised her hand with a rehearsed smile and a breath that sounded just a little too forced. "Madam Speaker, if I may," she said with a laugh that didn't quite land. "I believe we're here to discuss policy, not personal." Jasmine's voice cut through her sentence, not loud, but too firm to ignore. "Oh, now it's personal," she said, not missing a beat. "Because when you took a shot at my intelligence, my presence, My legitimacy in this chamber, you didn't care whether it was personal then. Her tone hadn't risen, but every word landed harder than the last. The room, still tense, felt like it had tilted just slightly in Jasmine's direction. Nancy tried again, this time reaching for what she thought would be an upper hand. Congresswoman Crockett, I think you're taking things out of context. My comments weren't directed at you. Then have the courage to say who they were for. Jasmine fired back instantly, her voice still calm, but something steely had crept in. Because when you cast vague insults, you don't get to retreat behind ambiguity. Either say what you meant or own that you meant to be cruel. That line echoed across the chamber. It wasn't just about Congress anymore, it was about a pattern. About women in rooms where power tries to diminish them quietly, with smiles and passive slaps dressed as jokes. The chairwoman at the head of the room raised her gavel but didn't strike it. Instead, she looked at both women, brows furrowed, unsure whether to intervene or let it play out. For the first time, it seemed like the entire room was grappling with something deeper than legislative text. They were watching a reckoning unfold in real time. Jasmine turned now not just to Nancy, but to the entire room. Let's talk about what we tolerate in this chamber, she said, her voice warming now, igniting with something deeper than frustration. Because too often, we let subtle bias dress itself up as decorum. We let digs at someone's culture, accent, appearance, and background slip by as spirited debate. But if we're really serious about governance, about leadership, then we need to be serious about respect. Her hand gestured slowly across the seats before her. We don't need to agree on policy to act like we belong to the same nation. We just need to remember that we serve people who are watching, who are begging us to be better than the petty politics they see on TV. Now some heads were nodding, not just her party members. Across the aisle, a few looked down uncomfortably, knowing they had laughed at Mace's remark earlier, perhaps too easily. Jasmine wasn't yelling, she didn't have to. The conviction in her tone, the clarity made her words feel like they'd been waiting to be said for a long, long time. Nancy tried once more, now visibly shaken. Look, if anyone took offense, that wasn't my intention, she muttered, clearly cornered now. Jasmine paused, letting that hang in the air for a full second before responding. If anyone took offense, is not an apology, it's a dodge. And the people who sent us here didn't ask for dodges. They asked for leaders. And with that, Jasmine stepped down from the podium. There was no applause, because this wasn't a victory lap. But even the air in the chamber felt different now. Jasmine returned to her seat slowly, and as she sat down, a quiet but firm nod came from Representative Anna Green across the room. A woman who rarely engaged in these conflicts had just silently pledged her respect. This wasn't about the insult anymore. This was about the shift Jasmine had caused. A shift that would ripple into the next session, the next bill, and the next time someone tried to shrink her with words. Because this moment, raw and honest and unfiltered, had drawn a line in the sand, and the entire room knew it. But Jasmine also knew this wasn't the end. Nancy Mace was calculating already. Embarrassed. And embarrassed people don't disappear quietly. Something was coming. And Jasmine would be ready. Jasmine sat back down in her chair, but the weight of the room had shifted. It wasn't just the palpable tension between her and Nancy Mace anymore. It was the weight of unspoken words and realizations. The room was beginning to turn in her favor. Those in the chamber, some hesitant before, were now looking at her not just as a colleague or a fellow representative, but as someone who had just made a point so sharp, so necessary, that it was impossible to ignore. Nancy, still visibly flustered, fiddled with a pen in her hands, trying to regain composure. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on her notes or shift her eyes to the speaker, she couldn't seem to shake off the magnitude of Jasmine's words. For a moment, the air felt too heavy. The lines had been drawn, and while Nancy might have believed she had the upper hand moments ago, Jasmine had just flipped the script. The chairwoman cleared her throat, a feeble attempt to bring order back to the proceedings. But she knew it was too late for that. What had just transpired wasn't something you could sweep under the rug, no matter how hard you tried. She motioned for the next representative to take the floor, but no one moved. No one was ready to speak. It was as if everyone was frozen, caught in the current of what had just happened. Jasmine, sensing the change in the atmosphere, took a moment to gather herself. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. She could feel the room waiting for her to make her next move, unsure of what she might say, but sure that it would have weight. Finally, she leaned forward, just enough to make the next words count. "Let's be clear," she began, her voice steady, deliberate, and filled with an energy that commanded attention. "We're all here to serve the people. It's not about the titles we hold. It's not about who can shout the loudest or make the sharpest jab. It's about who's willing to step forward and say, 'I'm ready to lead.' And let me be clear, there are a lot of us who are ready to lead, but it takes more than being in the right position. It takes integrity. It takes compassion. And it takes the ability to listen, to hear what the people who sent us here are saying, even when it's uncomfortable." The room was quieter now. Jasmine had found the rhythm of her words, and each sentence was like a drumbeat in the stillness of the chamber. This wasn't just rhetoric, it was a call to action. A challenge to those who sat comfortably behind their desks, who thought they could get away with dismissing others with casual words. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "I'm asking for respect. For the people who look like me, for the communities I represent, for the women who are constantly overlooked and undermined, for the families who rely on us to do our job, not to squabble over trivial insults, but to get things done." She looked directly at Nancy as she spoke the next words. "Because when you try to diminish someone else to make yourself feel better, it's not just a bad look, it's a disservice to every person who trusted you to be their voice." The silence in the room was deafening, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes before change, when people are finally absorbing what's been said. And while Nancy tried to push the words away, you could see the shift in her expression. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't smug. She was thinking, and that was perhaps the most dangerous thing Jasmine could have done, make someone think. For a few moments, the only sound that filled the chamber was the distant clicking of keyboards as staff members took notes. Everyone else seemed to be caught in the same moment, caught between the weight of the words they had just heard and the uncomfortable realization that they might have been complicit in something they didn't even know was happening. And then, without warning, Jasmine stood up again. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for anyone to call on her. She simply rose from her seat, her presence commanding attention once more. This time, however, she wasn't just speaking to Nancy. She was speaking to everyone in the room. "You know, it's easy to get lost in the back and forth of politics," she said, her tone still firm, but with a note of sincerity that made it clear she wasn't just talking about Nancy anymore. "But at the end of the day, it's about who we're working for. And the people I represent aren't just numbers or statistics. They're real people. They're my neighbors, my family, my friends. They're the ones who trust us to be better, to do better. And that trust isn't something I take lightly." At this point, even Nancy had stopped trying to interrupt. She sat quietly, her hands clasped in front of her, clearly unable to defend herself against the barrage of truth that Jasmine had just unleashed. There was no clever response, no snappy comeback, just the silence of someone who knew they had been bested. Jasmine paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the room. "So no, I won't be silenced. I won't allow you to minimize me, my experiences, or the struggles of those I represent. And I won't let this go." Her voice dropped, but it was still filled with the same undeniable power. Because when one of us stands up, we all stand up, and that's how we change things. She let the words settle for a moment. The weight of them lingered in the room, unspoken but powerful. Jasmine wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let this be swept under the rug. And everyone in the room knew it. Jasmine returned to her seat once again, but this time it wasn't just about taking a break. It was about taking her position in the room, taking her place in history. And no matter what happened next, no one would forget this moment. The ball was now in Nancy's court, and it was clear she wasn't ready for what was coming next. The room was still for a long time. No one moved. No one spoke, but the atmosphere had changed. What had begun as a simple exchange of words had transformed into something much more profound. The silence stretched on, thick with anticipation, and the energy in the room felt heavier than ever. Jasmine had made her point, but the battle wasn't over. The temperature in the chamber had shifted. It wasn't just a political exchange anymore. It was a test of character. Who was willing to back down? Who would bend under the pressure? And who would stand tall and firm no matter the odds? Jasmine sat still, her hands resting on the desk in front of her. Her eyes never wavered from Nancy, who, despite her earlier bravado, was now struggling to maintain her composure. Nancy's usual confident, sharp demeanor had been replaced with a quiet uncertainty, and her mouth moved as though she was trying to find the right words, but nothing came out. She blinked rapidly, as though trying to gather her thoughts, but every time she opened her mouth, she seemed to falter. There was no retort, no comeback. Just a sense of realization dawning on her that she had underestimated Jasmine in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the words that had struck Nancy so deeply. It was the way Jasmine had carried herself, calm, collected, unapologetically confident. Jasmine wasn't just defending herself. She was standing up for every person who had ever been dismissed or belittled. Every woman, every marginalized voice. And now she was reminding Nancy that her attempt to undermine had backfired in the most public way possible. Jasmine looked around the room, her gaze sweeping over the other representatives. For a brief moment, it seemed like the entire chamber had held its breath. There was no murmuring, no whispering. Only the sounds of the chairs shifting slightly, people adjusting in their seats, as they all processed the gravity of what had just happened. Jasmine had made them see the bigger picture, the one they often chose to ignore. It was a moment of clarity, and in that silence, it was as if everyone knew something had just changed. Nancy cleared her throat, trying to regain some semblance of control, but her voice was smaller now, tinged with an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. I didn't mean to," she started, her words faltering as she looked down at her papers, trying to find something, anything, to hold on to. Jasmine didn't let her off the hook that easily. "You didn't mean to what?" she asked, her voice cool, sharp, and unwavering. "You didn't mean to make a disrespectful comment? Or you didn't mean to challenge me and the people I represent? Because I'm sure, at the time, you felt pretty confident about it. But the truth is, when we start questioning the worth of others based on superficial differences, we're not doing our job. And clearly, we're not leading by example." The room was quiet, the kind of silence that made every word stand out, every heartbeat loud in your ears. No one interrupted. No one dared to make a sound. Even Nancy was quiet now, trying to process the weight of the moment. Jasmine leaned forward again, her eyes locked onto Nancy's. "You see, it's not just about us. It's about the people we serve, the people we've been entrusted to represent. And when you insult someone based on their background, their appearance, or their beliefs, you don't just hurt them, you hurt everyone who's counting on us to make things right. The people who rely on us to show respect, to lead with dignity. You've forgotten that, Nancy, but it's not too late to learn." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire chamber was holding its breath. Nancy's face flushed with embarrassment, and her shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of Jasmine's words was sinking in deeper than she was willing to admit. She wasn't the only one who felt it. Jasmine had made sure that everyone in the room was feeling the heat of her message. They had all witnessed a direct challenge to the way things had been, and they could not ignore it. Jasmine's voice softened slightly, but there was no less intensity in her words. It's not just about us being right. It's about doing what's right. And I'll say it again, when we make space for each other, when we respect one another, we make room for everyone to succeed. We make room for change. Nancy finally spoke again, but it was clear she wasn't prepared for Jasmine's resolve. I apologize if I offended you, she said, but her voice sounded weak, a stark contrast to the confidence she had carried into the exchange. Jasmine raised an eyebrow, her tone calm but firm. Apologies are good, Nancy, but actions speak louder than words. Apologizing now doesn't change the fact that you tried to tear me down in front of this room, and that's something we'll all remember. She paused for a beat, but you still have time to do better. We all do. The room had gone eerily silent again. Every eye was on Jasmine, as if they were waiting for her to say more, waiting for the next thing she would do. But Jasmine wasn't done yet. No, this wasn't the time for her to back down. She'd already delivered the message, and now it was time to see if anyone would heed it. Nancy, still reeling from the intensity of the exchange, tried once more to regain her footing. But this time, it was different. The force of Jasmine's words had left a mark. Nancy couldn't just walk away from this unscathed. The air in the chamber was different now, heavier, more uncertain. I think, Jasmine began, her voice steady, we've all learned something today. But this conversation isn't over, Nancy, and it shouldn't be over for anyone in this room. It's time for all of us to step up, to do better, to be better. And with that, Jasmine took her seat once more, her gaze steady, her presence unwavering. The room was still, but not for long. Slowly, murmurs began to spread. People exchanged glances, their faces reflecting the realization that they had witnessed something significant. And although the chamber wasn't in chaos, it was clear that a shift had occurred, a shift that no one would soon forget. Jasmine sat back, waiting for the next move. But she knew that no matter what happened next, she had already made her mark. She had already stood her ground and delivered a message that wouldn't be ignored. The room remained filled with a heavy, unspoken energy after Jasmine's bold statement. There was a pause, a long, pregnant silence, thick with expectation. For a moment, it seemed like time itself had stopped, as if the weight of her words had frozen everything in place. The murmurs that had started before were now replaced by the unmistakable sound of the room, collectively taking a breath. Jasmine had spoken, and in her words lay a truth that couldn't be easily dismissed. The usual politics, the usual feigned civility, all seemed to evaporate in the wake of her challenge. Nancy sat back in her chair, her face flushed with the realization that she had been exposed, and the room was watching her every move. For the first time in a long while, she didn't have an immediate response. There was no snappy retort, no quick defense. Only the uncomfortable weight of knowing that her attempt to undermine Jasmine had been met with the unyielding force of Jasmine's conviction. Nancy looked down at her hands, which were now nervously clasped in her lap, betraying her internal struggle. She had been confident, maybe even arrogant, moments ago. But now she was beginning to realize the magnitude of what had just happened. Jasmine, however, didn't let the moment linger. She had said what needed to be said, and now it was time to move forward, to give the room and, more importantly, Nancy the space to reflect on what had just transpired. But that didn't mean she was finished. No, Jasmine had more to say, more to teach, more to demand. It wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about something far more significant: justice, dignity, and the responsibility they all had to represent the people they served. The members of the chamber slowly began to stir, some exchanging glances, others shifting in their seats. There were whispers, and they were growing louder. Jasmine had ignited something within them, something they couldn't ignore, something that had been buried under layers of political games and scripted performances. Her words had cut through the layers of the facade, forcing them to confront the reality of the situation. The people they represented deserved better, and it was time for them to step up. Nancy, still reeling from the verbal barrage, stood up slowly, her eyes scanning the room, uncertain of what to say or do next. But before she could speak, one of her colleagues, a fellow representative, stood up. He cleared his throat, casting a glance at Jasmine, his voice loud and clear. "We've heard what Jasmine said," he began, his tone measured but firm. "And I think it's time we all take a hard look at ourselves, at how we treat each other, at how we treat those we serve. Jasmine's right. This isn't just about us. It's about the people who trust us to do better." The room went silent once again, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. It wasn't just a comment on the situation, it was a call to action, a plea for self-reflection. The other representatives, some of whom had been silent observers until now, seemed to realize that the moment Jasmine had created was bigger than any one of them. It was about leadership. It was about doing the right thing, not the easy thing. Jasmine, who had been quietly observing the unfolding scene, nodded subtly. Her eyes never left the colleague who had spoken. She knew that this was the kind of response that mattered. Not the empty apologies, not the hollow justifications, but real change, real understanding, and a commitment to do better. That was the kind of leadership she had been asking for. But just as things seemed to be settling down, Nancy made her move. She stood up slowly, her face now pale, her voice shaky but determined. "I just want to say that I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I let my emotions get the best of me, and I know that was wrong. Jasmine, I disrespected you, and I shouldn't have. It wasn't my place." The room was quiet as Nancy spoke, and for a moment, it seemed like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see how Jasmine would respond. The tension in the air was palpable, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't rush to forgive, nor did she lash out. Instead, she remained calm, poised, and measured, exactly what she had been since the moment she first addressed the chamber. Nancy hesitated, and for the first time, the facade she had put on for so long seemed to crack. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she looked down at the floor, as if trying to compose herself. She had been the one in power, the one who had tried to assert dominance, but now she was realizing that true power didn't come from belittling others. It came from understanding, from growth, and from the courage to admit when you were wrong. Jasmine finally spoke, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight. "I appreciate your apology, Nancy," she said, "but apologies alone aren't enough. We need to do better, not just for ourselves, but for the people we represent. We need to show them that we're capable of change. We need to lead by example, and that starts with how we treat each other." Nancy nodded slowly, her face reflecting the internal shift that was happening within her. She knew that Jasmine was right. Apologies were a start, but they were only the beginning. True change required action, and it required everyone to hold themselves accountable. For the first time, Nancy seemed to understand the gravity of her words, and the room seemed to share in that understanding. This wasn't just a small mistake, it was a call for something deeper, something more meaningful. And Jasmine had opened their eyes to that truth. The chamber was still, the weight of the conversation settling in. And though there was no immediate resolution, something profound had occurred. Jasmine had sparked a conversation about accountability, respect, and the power of words. But more than that, she had shown them all that real leadership wasn't about grand gestures or flashy speeches. It was about honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to stand firm in the face of adversity. As the meeting drew to a close, the representatives left the room with a lot to think about. Some walked out in silence, others deep in conversation, but all of them carried the same sense of realization. Change had to start with them. And for Jasmine, that was enough. She had planted the seed, and now it was up to them to nurture it. Jasmine sat back in her chair, her shoulders relaxed for the first time that day. She knew this wasn't the end. There would be more challenges, more moments like this, but she was ready. She had made her point. She had been heard. And that, she thought with quiet satisfaction, was a victory in itself. As she left the chamber, the words echoed in her mind. We need to do better. That was the message. And Jasmine knew that as long as she kept pushing for it, as long as she kept speaking truth to power, she would continue to make a difference. One conversation at a time.
Thank you for watching our channel Modern Stories. If you liked our video, you should subscribe for more amazing videos like this. Have a healthy and happy day. See you in the next one.